Ever since the beginning of the gaming enterprise in the late 20th century, there have been efforts to modify or enhance various aspects, whether it was modding, cheats, piracy, or emulation. I would love to generalize all of them as positive. However, it depends on case-by-case basis. We had Goliaths of the industry like Sony, Sega, and Nintendo. Developers from these companies pioneered not only the best gaming franchises, but also the platforms they be played on. Back then, not only were we navigating this uncharted territory, but we were also trying to figure out that whole video game thing. So from this point, significant precedents were setting, but who was in charge of it all? From 1983 to 1985, United States witnessed a huge gaming crash. Several contributing factors were to blame. Notable of them are saturation within the industry and awful quality of games. In addition, a huge economic recession exacerbated the circumstances. Consumers needed confidence to purchase the games. To combat this, Nintendo developed its seal of approval, which translated into highest levels of quality assurance. Firmly standing behind its seal of approval, their claim was substantiated through their legendary titles. They will always remain timeless. I, among countless others, respect their work. To this day, one of my all-time favorites is Super Mario World. This company played an enormous part in reviving the industry. Nevertheless, Nintendo had a key element when it came to their products that has been practiced ever since the business's inception. That key element? Rigid ownership of all things Nintendo. I believe there's absolutely nothing wrong with this perspective, but their inability to adapt to modern times, their generalization of anything related to their property as stealing, and their unwavering black and white decision-making philosophy while lacking any exceptions or any empathy are their defining characteristics. In the late 80s and 90s, some people still couldn't afford games, or some just wanted to check them out without actually purchasing them. As a result, video game rentals came into play. Back then, the Nintendo of America's chairman called it commercial rape. Nintendo then sued Blockbuster. How does it feel hearing this statement now? Aren't we all like, yeah, that tracks? And who could forget their lawsuit against Game Genie, where they made the claim that the code was derivative work. Ever since the beginning, there are countless instances of them suing ROM sites, sending fans cease and desist letters, shutting down fan game creations, claiming revenue from YouTubers, and most importantly, their stance against emulation. I admit there might have been instances where their actions were fair, but most of these examples were just fans and developers trying to nurture the fan base and the things they loved. But Nintendo wasn't the only giant involved in these tactics. Sony sued Connectic's Virtual Game Station, a PlayStation 1 emulator. Court sided with CVGX, but Sony, being petty, appealed the decision. As a result, they were awarded temporary injunction, meaning CVGX couldn't sell their emulator. Long story short, Sony was using court loopholes, and it was pretty clear that they were gonna stop at nothing to crush the emulator. Admitting defeat, CVGX then sold their project to Sony, who killed it immediately after. They also sued another emulator, Bleem. Court ruled in Bleem's favor. They then insisted on suing them for using copyright images in their advertising material. Court ruled in Sony's favor. Bleem then appealed the decision and they actually won. That victory was short-lived, however, as Bleem went bankrupt due to legal fees. Generally speaking, emulators are legal, but it depends on where you are located. As we talked about companies bankrupting developers, even if they are legal, no one wants to go against these ginormous companies who have infinitely more resources than the developers. Nevertheless, I don't think we should focus on the legality of fan creations or mods or emulators, but rather the intent behind them. These shouldn't be about rigid definitions or legal frameworks. The moment we side with the latter, these aren't games or platforms that mean a lot to us. These are products and IPs whose sole purpose is to generate profit by any means necessary. I wrote this statement for emulators, but it's ironic how well it fits in with the current state of gaming corporations. We download these emulators, use them, and don't pay that much attention to the landscape. I want to take some time to acknowledge the amazing developers responsible for the emulators that we use every day, and the emulators that set invaluable precedents. So this video is probably the best chance I'm gonna get. You can't talk about emulators without mentioning Nesticle. This NES emulator set in motion one of the biggest revolutions in gaming. The earliest emulator that provided tools to ROM hack and mod the games. I also have to mention Nesticle's corporation name, bloodlust software. This is the most 90s thing I've ever heard and I love it. Next up, PCSX2, by far my favorite emulator of all time. Two developers, Linus Apps and Shadow, who had just decided in 2001 that their previous project PCSX, the PlayStation 1 emulator, was good enough. This duo embarked on emulating the latest console, PlayStation 2. At that point, they were getting the prerequisites ready. Other developers, Loser, that's the name they go by, I'm not insulting them, Florin and Sakib joined the cause. They had little to no documentation and schematics. Also, the hardware they had was not the best. After some time, they were able to run a very basic homebrew software, and here we are. Various coders who were passionate about the cause kept joining the team. They emulated the PS2 BIOS file, and then the recompiler was added. From then, it was iterative refinements with occasional huge updates. I've been following the development of this emulator since 2009, and ever since I've tested almost every build on my crappy PC to see if I get any performance gain. To give you an idea how monumental the development of the PS2 emulator is, the console is based on Toshiba Emotion Engine or EE and the graphics synthesizer GS. Architecture of the PS2 was amazing and performance oriented, but it came at a hefty cost. It was unbelievably complex and way different than your typical PC architecture. That's why development of the emulator was a ludicrous challenge. It took them more than 2 decades to make every single game bootable. Around 98% of the catalog is perfectly playable. So yeah, this emulator will always be in the world to me, because my first ever YouTube video was about PCSX2 back in 2011. It was called How to Run Tekken 5 on 128 megabytes of video memory. And we're talking the integrated Intel GPU, not a dedicated one, and Pentium 4. I don't remember the exact error details, but if you ran the game normally, it would crash because the pixel shader version wasn't high enough. But through some crazy string of events, I found a workaround. If you ran the Codebreaker's ELF file and booted the game through that, it wouldn't crash. That video was on a different old channel, but I was so embarrassed by it, I deleted it in 2017. It got like 2800 views in a week. Back then, I just wanted to share a workaround for people with lower end PCs. Oh man, apologies, we've gotten way off topic. My second favorite emulator of all time is RPCS3, PlayStation 3, the only architecture that can give PS2 a run for its money for the title of most complicated. It was also performance oriented, so much so that United States Air Force used a cluster of PS3s for supercomputer-like tasks. Again, the architecture couldn't be more different than a regular PC. DH and Haikam founded the project in 2011. After getting small homebrew software working, they kept on going with more people joining the team, eventually getting some small games into intros with sound. However, two of the main legends of this emulator, Neko Takina and KD11, supercharged this emulator. It took the team more than a decade to make every game bootable. I remember back in 2011, I downloaded RPCS3 and it was just a little debugger window. After getting my hands on Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection's PKG file, I immediately tried to boot up that file, but it just showed me debugging instructions. Now, this is a beast of an emulator. Next up, Ryujinx, one of the fastest development I've ever seen for an emulator. NVIDIA Tegra is not nearly as complex as PS3 or PS2's design, but still a monumental challenge. GDK-chan started Ryujinx in 2018, and to this day, their commitment and their passion are incredibly admirable. And finally, Yuzu. Ryujinx and Yuzu went head to head, and their friendly competition brought us so many innovations. We had two teams of developers dedicated to their impossible goal. Having two emulators of same caliber for a recent console is still unheard of. That's what made these emulators so unique. Unfortunately, Yuzu was taken down by Nintendo for aiding in piracy. When I heard this news, it enraged the ever-living out of me. I'll try to keep my composure, but Nintendo, how did you reach at that conclusion? Nothing's changed about your core philosophy. It doesn't matter how much passion and hard work the devs put into their project, or how much this meant to our community, or how much people donated to that project. You can just come in and take away 6 years of hard work and dedication in an instant. You couldn't be more obvious about your priorities and your soullessness. Yuzu didn't want to fight back and was sued $1.2 million in damages. And I can understand their situation. Fighting back would have probably costed them more, and even after that, they might have ended up paying those damages. Here's their official statement, and it's painfully obvious who wrote this. Tears of Kingdom them was leaked before it's released, and people dumped the XEI file and distributed on the emulator's Discord server. So some were essentially running the game. By the way, that goes to show the developers' hard work. They didn't even tinker with the emulator to tailor it for that game, and it still played. But why wasn't the leaker punished? Why Yuzu? That's not how you deal with a disaster from your end. You can still find Yuzu with unofficial names, builds, and forks. Nintendo keeps shutting them down, but they keep popping up. Weird how that works. $61 billion and still being so petty. You should make it your slogan, by the way. And who could forget Gary Bowser? I highly recommend reading his entire history. But in short, Nintendo hit him with a civil lawsuit of $14.5 million. Eventually, they settled on an installment plan, meaning Gary, a 55-year-old, will pay a portion of his salaries to Nintendo for his entire life. And he might pass away before his debt is even cleared. He definitely broke a lot of piracy laws and he was punished. But I don't think the punishment fits the crime. Last thing I want to touch on is the justification for the actions. Protecting your intellectual property? Yeah, go for it. Don't care if you're an individual or a corporation. Need a ROM of an old game? Has it been re-released? If yes, then go buy the re-release or the remaster. But what if it hasn't been re-released, or it's just a cash grab, or it's not as good as the original? For example, GTA Definitive Trilogy. You can try buying a cartridge at eBay auction, which are extremely rare and expensive, and sometimes you can't even buy that. One of my favorite NES games is Keropi no Daiboken 2. We have literally no choice but to emulate these games, and if we don't want these precursors to be lost to time, we must protect them because their owners sure won't. I hate generalizing, and especially in regards to this particular topic. We must look at things case by case basis. But I will make an exception. The developers, modders, users, and supporters, we're part of an amazing community. Our intent was never to harm anyone's IP or their revenue. Some of us couldn't afford games or game consoles at some point. Some of us wanted to emulate to relive our childhood. To some of us, these weren't products, but experiences that meant the world to us and distracted us from our day-to-day routines. To some, the passion was so significant that they contributed to the landscape by creating their own mods. We should all be proud to be a part of this community. I have, and I will always have nothing but utmost respect for anyone that has developed an emulator. You are not unheard, and as long as I have a platform to talk, I will always highlight your contributions. So, kudos to all of us. I hope all of us keep on going, even in the face of the most uncertain adversities.
Come on, adversity. Deal with me, dog.
My deepest apologies to so many emulators that couldn't talk about today, like PPSSPP, Citra, Xenia, and the amazing work that the PS4 emulator devs are doing. I'm putting some links in the description, GitHub support page for PCSX2, and Patreon link for RPCS3 and Ryujinx. Also the link to Gary Bowser's GoFundMe page, who's looking to restart his entire life after spending time in prison. If you can support any of these causes, that would be legendary. Thanks for the support, guys. If you like this perspective, please like and subscribe. This is Rogue Hat. Catch you guys later.